My name is Kim McQuay, and I lead the Asia Foundation's Program Specialist Group, a team of technical specialists in our core program areas, including conflict and fragility. I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar to launch the second edition of the Foundation's report on the state of conflict and violence in Asia, identity-based conflict and extremism. A brief word on the format of the webinar to start. We'll begin with 8 to 10 minute presentations by our three speakers, then transition to a question and answer session. For the Q&A, we'll be taking questions via the channel located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You're welcome to pose questions broadly or to individual speakers, and we'll do our best to direct questions or to cluster those on related themes. Our Zoom platform includes accessibility features on which we'll be posting details in the chat space to ensure full and inclusive access by all participants. For those new to the Asia Foundation, we're an international NGO with headquarters in San Francisco, a liaison in Washington, D.C., your host today, and a network of 18 country offices in South, Southeast, and Northeast Asia, with the Pacific Islands soon to be added. Since 1954, we've worked with partners in government, civil society, academia, and the private sector through a combination of grant-making, technical support, and operational programs. Our areas of focus include good governance, conflict and fragility, women's empowerment and gender equality, inclusive economic growth, environment and climate action, regional and international relations, and technology. Our extensive work on conflict and fragility underscores the Foundation's commitment to working with Asian governments, local partners, and conflict-affected communities to reduce and prevent conflict and violence through a range of programmatic approaches. Our work draws heavily on several key institutional competencies. These include a focus on the interface of governance, conflict, and tensions giving rise to violence, with our work informed by rigorous analysis of local political, cultural, and other contexts and field work, on strong trust relations with our local partners, on our substantive experience in peace-building negotiations and discourse, as well as context-driven responses to violence against women and local-level violence reduction through participatory governance. And finally, cross-sectoral approaches to specific sectors that affect conflict risks, including environment and climate action, technology, and women's empowerment and gender equality. The State of Conflict Report is one of many research initiatives led by our conflict team, through which the Foundation contributes to thought leadership and shares evidence-based learning and program recommendations in the public domain. We hope that the second edition of the report will be well received by readers and users, and welcome your questions today, as well as later feedback as you spend time with the very full report, accessible in digital format. I'll now briefly introduce our three speakers. Adam Burke is the Asia Foundation's Bangkok-based Director of Conflict and Fragility Programs. Over the last 20+ years, Adam has held a variety of positions with and undertaken assignments for the United Kingdom, the United Nations, the World Bank and Asian Development Bank, and the OECD. His Asian experience spans Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Nepal, Pakistan, Philippines, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Vietnam, and other countries. Adam's work has underlined the importance of understanding and responding to specific political contexts in peace building and development, with political economy analysis figuring prominently in his work. He's led and authored a number of analytical reports for the Foundation and other organizations, and we are grateful for his leadership of the State of Conflict Report. Sadie Jones is the director of the Jakarta-based Institute for Policy Analysis of Conflict. From 2000 to 2013, she served as Southeast Asia Project Director for the International Crisis Group. Cindy's superb analysis, insights, and recommendations have for many years been welcomed as required reading for Asia Foundation country leadership and program staff, including myself. She previously served with Ford Foundation, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch. Cindy is a recognized and keenly sought expert on security in Southeast Asia, with a specialty focus on Islamist radicalism and extremism in the region. Her broader publications include labor migration, ethnic conflicts, ethno-nationalist insurgencies, and conflicts over land. We're honored that Sydney has contributed a thoughtful keynote overview of identity conflicts in Southeast Asia, on which she'll speak this morning. Finally, Sophia Shaquille is the Asia Foundation's Manila-based Director of Economic Programs, who earlier twice served as our country representative to Pakistan. Sophia has a background in economic and development policy and a depth of experience with international development organizations. She previously served as ADB's Principal Knowledge Management Specialist for Innovations and as Senior Education Specialist with both ADB and the World Bank. Under Sophia's leadership, the Foundation is sharpening the strategic focus of our support for the inclusive economic growth of the Asian Pacific regions, including policy support for advanced middle income countries, future of work, women's economic empowerment, education reform, and securing the broader conditions needed for the private sector to thrive in a new global economy. Adam, I invite you to lead us off with Sydney and Sophia to follow. I'll be back a bit later in the program to facilitate Q&A.
Thank you, everyone. Very pleased to be presenting this report after a long period of preparation and research. Grateful also if people can keep microphones muted so that the sound is as clear as possible, given that people are logging in from all sorts of places. With this State of Conflict and Violence in Asia second edition, the first edition came out 4 or 5 years ago, we saw this as an opportunity to focus attention on critical concerns beyond the detailed data gathering which has gone into the country chapters. So we have the broader regional overviews in part 1 before the country level detail in part 2. And we'll be concentrating mainly on the broader regional overviews today. Identity-based conflict and violent extremism, that's the second part of the title of the report. And it sums up what we're going to be exploring. We sought to take a step back first in writing this report and putting it together before addressing these prominent and concerns that are addressed in the popular sphere very regularly and have been over the last few years, given their resonance globally. And we're trying to offer a regional overview, particularly for South and Southeast Asia, exploring common trends and asking what lies behind them. The report presents a range of views through its 3 guest chapters, all of them quite concise and hopefully accessible. As we move through this analysis in the report, we immediately see some clear trends, which I'll try and summarize here in a few brief minutes. That graph we'll probably come to in a moment, actually, so bear with us on that one. What we see broadly across the region is disenchantment with a political mainstream, which has facilitated in several countries the emergence of controversial leaders. We've seen identity politics rising to the fore in many places, and public debate has become increasingly polarized also in numerous countries. Global power struggles have returned as China gained in confidence and stature. The COVID pandemic, meanwhile, swept across this confrontational terrain, in many cases turning up the heat on tensions at ground level. A trend towards more authoritarian governance is well established in many Asian countries, and indicators such as the Economist's Democracy Index, as well as various others, show a significant regional decline. This is reflected in diminishing space for independent media, growing restrictions on civil society, and has led to popular protests in several countries. Political leaders have appeared increasingly willing to tolerate or even encourage, in cases, a resurgence of identity-based tensions in order to build their support base. This has been seen most clearly in the violent displacement of some 700,000 or more Rohingya from Myanmar to Bangladesh. Deadly majoritarian violence, meanwhile, perpetrated mainly by organized and often politically connected mobs, has also broken out in several other countries. Meanwhile, violent extremism persists. While the greatest fears of jihadist influence have not been realized, the interplay of international influences and local grievances remains a concern. Perhaps most evident in the siege of Marawi in the Philippines in 2017, when militants seized a city and the subsequent violence led to over 1,000 deaths. In Asia, as elsewhere, the term violent extremism is no longer applied solely to jihadist movements. Polarizing politics are associated with a fringe in extremist perspectives and overt violence carried out by a radical fringe, sometimes politically supported, among Buddhist and Hindu as well as Muslim populations. These trends have been fueled by online disinformation sponsored by extremists and at times, as I mentioned, by political leaders too. Now, this all paints a picture of quite significant breakdown. It sounds dramatic and concerning, and indeed in many ways it is. But at this point, I think it's worth taking a step back and looking at some of the statistics on violence across the region, as it's interesting and it presents a less straightforward picture, which in many ways is counterintuitive. This graph, which is up now, indicates the number of fatalities through armed conflict or organized armed conflict or battles. Sometimes they're known as battle deaths in Asia since 2010. This is particularly South and Southeast Asia, although if you included East Asia, it wouldn't differ hugely. And one of the important points here is that it includes Afghanistan. Now, what you see, apart from an anomaly of 2020, the last column, is overall an increase over the last 6 or 7 years in levels of violence. However, if we show the same graph, but without Afghanistan, you see a very, very different trend. So in fact, what that graph is showing is more or less conflict in Afghanistan rather than anything else, which indicates the severity of the conflict there, increasing severity over the decade from 2010 up to 2020, and indeed beyond. What you see here is a significant decrease. So rather than conflict getting worse, despite all these concerns and problems and trends that I mentioned, the actual number of people dying in wars has gone down. There's a blip in 2017, which is explained by the two incidences which I already referred to, Rohingya in Myanmar and the siege of Marawi in the Philippines. But even then you can see, if you look at the numbers, they're slightly hard to read on the slide, but you're talking about 6,000, 5,000, 4,000 and still less per year, which for an area with such a large population and a large number of countries, these are quite low levels historically or even globally. So what's going on here? Why is there such a significant decline? Which is, these figures are taken from one database, but other databases indicate a similar trend. And these conflicts, what's actually causing the casualties, both in 2010 and 10 years later throughout this period, it's mostly subnational conflict or forms of civil unrest. There are growing regional tensions, but with the odd exception, they haven't generated huge numbers of casualties. So civil war at a national level is also only really prevalent in Afghanistan, with the possible exception of Myanmar that comes after this data set, since the coup early in 2021 there. And you've seen that the numbers of people dying in these subnational conflicts, in localized conflicts across the region, has been going down. Throughout this period, many of the bloodiest of these internal conflicts have got a lot less bloody. Examples include Mindanao, Indian Kashmir, the northwestern frontier of Pakistan, far south of Thailand, all considerably less violent over the course of the previous decade. Why? Well, in some cases, there have been reforms or concessions by the government, some form of political change on the ground locally and often nationally. But in many of these sites of violence, what you've seen is greatly increased state capacity to impose security measures and enforce peace. So many of Asia's conflicts still continue. All of those I just mentioned are still conflict areas. But the state has subdued some of the violence. States are in more control of their territory as they've become on average wealthier, and security services are better funded over what a period of what are historically extremely fast rates of economic growth across much of Asia. And these trends, I don't think they contradict the broad points I just made before on declining civil society space, increasing authoritarianism, and so on. I think they confirm them in many ways. So what you see is an increase or a significant level of tension across the board, but increasing state control in many ways. And that fits the description of increasing authoritarianism across the region as well. Where that leads to in future is not yet clear, but it is certainly clear that there are going to be continued and persistent tensions of many sorts, with a continued mixture of some suppression and perhaps some reforms in places. Throughout the report, we try to indicate some of these trends. Michael Vatikiotis offers a broad sweep of the region, and he stresses how domestic politics have repeatedly played to ethnic and religious tensions, while international support for liberal norms of pluralism, tolerance, and democracy have declined. Much of the tension being felt across the region is fueled by frustration and inequalities, and you've seen a revival of ethnic nationalism, of reinvented traditions, often linked with religious identity in Sri Lanka and India, more strident and exclusionary versions of Islam in typically tolerant Indonesia. These are very diverse or plural societies, and picking apart the fragile glue that binds them together may well be a recipe for increasing tensions or instability in future. The report also presents a striking set of findings on the links between social media and violence. We were fortunate to have been able to interview 3 eminent specialists, Sarah O, Sanjana Hatatua, and Maria Ressa. Maria, of course, has just become a Nobel Peace Prize laureate only a few days ago. And the interviews with all 3 present a strong call for action to stem current manipulation of online spaces by criminals, by extremists, by abusers of women, and especially by governments across much of the region. These interviews reveal a stark current situation, social media being a key driver, not the sole driver or the instigator, but a key factor in extremism and political manipulation. To quote Maria Ressa from the report, "We're on the precipice. This is destroying all of us. How do we prevent our tools, what we create, from destroying humanity and destroying our structures? What new structures do we need to put in place?" And on that last point of the new structures that we need to put in place, the report does try to point towards action that can be taken, and I think we'll be emphasizing this across the presentations today. In the online sphere, the interviews emphasize the need for the development of standards and norms, coalitions that operate at a range of levels, from the global down to the community, and particularly for non-governmental organizations such as the Asia Foundation, many more, both international and national or local. The scope to engage in many areas has been established, even as the space to do so has been shrinking. Conflict prevention measures, support for peace dialogue, represent a fraction of the amount that the international community spends on crisis responses and on reconstruction. So simply turning a funding tap on is not going to solve highly complex political problems, but it is part of the challenge. The response also requires nuanced understanding of country and local context, as well as the broader regional trends, and also requires support for local bodies as well as international. I'll stop here. I think the final comment I'd like to make, which I think cuts across many of these challenges and across proposed solutions, is that the word inequality crops up repeatedly, not only in economic inequality, but also frustration at being politically or socially marginalized. And this generates a lot of the fuel which enables violent protagonists to stoke both fear and conflict, whether online or otherwise. Focusing on supporting the role of women in conflict prevention is another common thread which appears overall to generate equality as well as peace. Knowledge how to engage across many of these sectors is increasing, especially in the field of countering extremism, where more nuanced approaches and recognition of gender dynamics are becoming mainstream. At that, I'll pass over to Sydney to continue the discussion, drawing on comments from her chapter. Very briefly, the report itself is now live online. You can get to it at the Asia Foundation website, or there is a dedicated website, stateofconflictinasia.org. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. And I'll pick up on some of Adam's themes here. I would like to look at how extremism, insurgency, and migration have become or continue to be major drivers of conflict and violence in the region, with a particular focus on Southeast Asia. Next. it's interesting if we look at how nationalist movements and extremist movements intersect in the region, because I think there are three major kinds of violence that we see taking place that involve nationalism and extremism in some form, and they often get intermixed. That said, before I go into these three, it's worthwhile also noting that extremist violence has gone down in Southeast Asia. We're seeing declining support for movements like ISIS, and even though we still have terrorist cells in Indonesia, the Philippines, and elsewhere in the region, there actually has been some success in countering violent extremism at the same time. But if we look at how these three intersect, we have ethno-nationalist movements, and where we have Muslim ethno-nationalist movements, there's always been concern that sooner or later these could morph into global jihadi movements. But it actually very rarely happens. Aceh never morphed into the global jihad. Thailand never showed any interest in joining the global jihad. None of the movements in the Deep South were interested. The Rohingya movements, by and large, have not been interested in affiliating with the global jihad. And you think about it, and it makes sense. Most of these movements, first of all, have very specific political goals related to ethnicity more than religion. And also, many of them are interested in international support, and it would be political suicide to affiliate with a global jihadi movement if you're interested in getting that kind of support. So by and large, these movements remain very distinct, but there are two major exceptions in the region. One is the Uyghur movement, where we've had a fringe violent movement, which has been used as justification by the Chinese government for intense repression of what amounts to the entire ethnic group. But also the Philippines has been an exception, where we've had ethno-nationalist movements identify, particularly since 2014, with ISIS. I think this is also declining, but it's worth thinking about why this took place in the Philippines and not elsewhere. And it has to do, I think, with the number of different insurgencies and the competition regionally and ethnically in the Philippines. We can get into that later. The second big division is the majoritarian political movements, which often use violence, but not of the terrorist kind. It's violence of the bricks, stones, iron pipes, thuggery kinds of violence that are characteristic of many of these movements, with that kind of violence often directed against minorities. And where you have terrorist movements often rejecting democracy, in a way, majoritarian political movements seek to use democracy as a way of getting into power. So many of the autocrats that we now see emerging in Southeast Asia have been democratically elected, and we see lots of majoritarian mobilization around election times in some of these countries. And one word on the global jihadi movements. There is a lot of concern now that there could be blowback to Southeast Asia from the rise of the Taliban, the return to Taliban, and what could be increased protection for Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. I think for Southeast Asia, most of these fears are somewhat overblown for a variety of reasons that we can talk about later. The interesting factor is that for Indonesia in particular, there was actually more interest in ISIS Khorasan in Afghanistan, with about 24 Indonesians having already tried to get to Khorasan, most of them ending up in detention, but some of them still unaccounted for in Khorasan. And one of the interesting reasons why Khorasan was such an attraction is because it had the same kind of end of time connotations that Syria had, with the idea that the Imam Mahdi's forces would arise in Khorasan. Okay, next slide. If you think about some of the government responses to these kinds of movements, one of the things we see is that there's often two wrong assumptions that are made. One that Adam referred to is that somehow poverty is the major driver of radicalization, and therefore economic development is the solution to ethno-nationalist violence, to majoritarian violence, and to extremist violence of the jihadi variety. It's almost never the sole factor, and oftentimes it's not even one of the key factors. So that, for example, economic development, if we're talking about an ethno-nationalist movement that's not Islamic in Papua, economic development is not the solution to the Papuan pro-independence movement, and it's not going to make political grievances go away. Likewise, there's an assumption that somehow there's a continuum from intolerance to majoritarianism to violent extremism, and that people who are involved in one kind of movement will graduate to the progressively more violent movement. This also very rarely takes place. Generally, the non-violent or the thuggery kinds of movements are very distinct from the violent extremist movements, and they don't intersect. But there is an assumption that particularly today in Indonesia is very pronounced, that these movements are linked, and that therefore there needs to be a crackdown on the majoritarian movements more generally. This has created this phenomenon that Greg Feely has termed repressive pluralism, because in its effort to stop radicalism in the country more generally, the Jokowi government has moved against groups defined as radical without being clear what the lines are that distinguish political dissent, criticism of the government, and potentially criminal activity. Again, many ways in which this is a development that's of concern. Another issue is that for minorities who become the target of violence or of political majoritarianism in some of these states, many do not want the work on their behalf to be seen as defense of minority rights. They want to be seen as full-fledged citizens. And therefore, when we think about responses, the responses are in terms of encouraging constitutional guarantees of citizenship that make people of any ethnicity or any religion able to enjoy the same kind of rights. Next. Next slide. A third kind of identity conflict that increasingly overlaps with some of the religious and ethnic issues is the division between migrants and indigenous. And this is increasingly an issue as it comes to land and resource conflicts across Southeast Asia, where we have expansion of palm oil plantations and other kinds of plantation agriculture into hinterlands occupied by indigenous groups, where competition over land becomes caught up with migrants coming in from outside the region, often associated with the dominant ethnic group, to work on some of these economic development projects or plantations, mining, and so on. And this can be an issue that increases conflict, that in some cases fuels ethno-nationalist conflict, but also can be something that targets, that makes migrants a target of violence themselves. And of course, we can see migration being used as a tool of the state to pacify some of these outlying hinterlands. So migrant versus indigenous has become a real major dividing line across Southeast Asia. We've also seen that as indigenous rights movements become a way of trying to establish claims to land and resources, the state, in many cases, has set up rival indigenous associations as a way of challenging some of these groups on the ground. So for all of these reasons, it's important to look at how migration and identity intersect with conflict. And finally, next slide. If we think about solutions, I think it's important to underscore that the Asia Foundation has been a pioneer in many of these efforts to reduce or address conflict. And in many cases, what we need to do is more of what the Asia Foundation is already doing. This includes getting more technical expertise on communication strategies to local NGOs that use social media or are using new technologies to address conflict. I think we absolutely have to protect investigative journalism, not only Maria Ressa, but investigative journalists across the region. It was great to see the Reuters journalists released from insane prison yesterday. I hope they stay out, but investigative journalism is critical. We need to find ways to document and address local land conflicts, looking where possible at non-judicial methods, often because the criminal justice systems are not always an impartial way of addressing these conflicts. Educational exchange programs across the region more generally, raising the capacity of some of the groups working on these issues. And we need to find a way for addressing military accountability, which remains a critical issue across the region. Thank you very much.
Okay, So I'm going to take a slightly different angle. Thank you, Sydney and Adam, for launching off on this. I'm going to talk about the vulnerabilities of migrant workers and looking at how this important segment of the regional economic workforce can move from a situation of perpetual and structural fragility to a state of long-term resilience to conflict and shocks. So just some perspectives and some numbers and patterns, just to lay that out. The Asia Pacific region is home to 1/5 of the world's migrant workers. That's almost 80 million, out of which 48 million work within the region. Majority of these work in migration corridors within the region, such as ASEAN, or cross-border migrants, such as India, Nepal, or Malaysia, Singapore, and comprise both seasonal and long-term workers. Internal migration with a rapid, with the kind of rapid urbanization that's driving workers towards cities or for seasonal labor on agricultural lands is also another facet. Many of the migrant workers are driven by distress. And whether it's distress compelled by conflicts such as in Myanmar, Bangladesh, or Afghanistan, or induced by calamity and climate change in the Pacific's small island states or coastal communities in much of the region. And I think, this is where it links back into the whole conflict agenda that, there's a lot of movement, and we heard from Sydney as well as Adam, there's the closing space, but how migrant workers are impacted. But those not driven by distress, but for purely economic reasons, are also caught in a web of vulnerabilities, characterized by low skills, largely gaining employment in the informal sector or in informal jobs in the formal economy, largely irregular or undocumented. So, if we want, let's take a little bit of a deeper look at the vulnerability, prism. A deeper examination of the vulnerabilities of the Asian Pacific migrant worker shows a range of structural challenges and conditions that we must try to understand and unpack before moving towards what it is that we can do to build their long-term resilience. So there's a heavy reliance on informal sector work. And this goes, for all workers, but in particular, looking at migrant workers. When you're relying on informal sector work, there's no social protection measures. You kind of tend to fall through the cracks, and you're marred by poor conditions of employment. Often, we see unsafe passage and living conditions, and characterized by physical abuse and dangerous conditions. And we particularly see that when it comes to the gender angle. Restricted, and we see, you just have to look, not even in Asia, but, just the headlines from, the workers, the migrants trying to flee conflict on boats and, crossing in from terrible conditions. Restricted, but what's more fundamental is that, migrant workers face restricted access to basic services. No access to healthcare, decent housing. Then there's the whole angle of social stigmatism, and that is basically brought upon by lack of documentation, and identity, fear of disease, etc. And this is something that has really particularly come out as we've seen how the pandemic has, put a spotlight on this. Then another very important angle is about the susceptibility to climate change, conflict, and other disaster impacts. And, this manifests itself with a sudden loss of livelihoods or income, where migrant workers have to quickly, their livelihoods are upended and they have to repatriate. And then, of course, poor rehabilitation upon return. And so as you can, just want to lay out that this is, quite a complex kind of set of challenges that migrant workers deal with. Now, all of these vulnerabilities are further amplified when looking at it from the gender dimensions. Migration provides, on one hand, an economic opportunity to women, but also exposes them to increased risk of new discrimination and gender-based violence. Women are certainly more susceptible to trafficking, given the undocumented nature of their employment. a large number of them are employed in domestic work and informal employment in the services industry. There is less regulation in sectors dominated by women, making them more susceptible to exploitation and unsafe conditions and work environments. Men also, there's an interesting dimension there where they're employed in construction or seasonal jobs, making them more vulnerable to shocks such as the pandemic, other incidents of conflict, and significantly more exploitative working conditions. Now, if we look at the social policy framework, what exists and its failure, on one hand, we see that there's a plethora of policies to protect migrant workers and workers in general. I mean, we've got the international conventions to protect workers, numerous laws and policies, the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly those relating to, providing sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth and decent work for all, or reducing inequalities within countries. I mean, then the ASEAN Consensus on Protection and Promotion of Rights and Migrant Workers is another example, and there's numerous sort of things. But the problem is that majority of the migrant workers, like other vulnerable workers that I'll just touch upon in a bit, fall through the cracks of policies and social safety nets. And, if we look at what this means in terms of the falling through the safety nets, migrant workers make up, are form, as I just said, like they work in the informal sector, largely undocumented. And what we've seen, if we move on, the pandemic has only spotlighted several underlying and systemic problems. I mean, as an example, the India migration problem during the early lockdown of COVID-19, or the persistent outbreaks and prolonged lockdowns of the Singapore migrant dormitories show, this is, truly a situation which is, just highlights some of the underlying systemic issues. Then there's the whole new dimension of the new economy, or the so-called new economy, where you've got the digital platform, the gig-based workers, which just reveals that there is a need to redefine work, how the definition of workers needs to be reviewed to include those that are part-time or gig workers, making the whole definition of the workforce more about welcome, to include worker welfare and taking it into the human rights dimension. I mean, basically, in order to build the long-term resilience of migrant workers, it's really important to focus on a number, three important things. First, to improve social policy, such as social protection programs, healthcare, housing conditions, and basic access to services. Supporting their social capital. Now, social capital is really essential because it involves building their, strengthening their networks, associations, and registration. If they're largely employed, workers are employed in the informal economy, they're not documented, they're going to fall through the cracks. So it's really important to support enhancing of the social capital. And then finally, investing in and imparting skills development, to upskill them to gain better employment opportunities, to move up the value chain. Migrant workers must be seen as more than just the sum of their remittances. Their contribution to the economic recovery will be as essential as they were during the pandemic, but also the long-term economic development of the home economy growth really depends on how we value migrant workers and returning migrants. And in conclusion, I would just say that, that while we see conflict and violence as definitely a major driver of migrant workers, economic migration is intricately linked to the push factor of conflict and violence that exists. And as Adam said, so aptly in his opening, the report sheds light on the closing space that we are facing, while migrant workers and workers in general, especially the vulnerable workers, are at the core of this agenda. So I'm gonna stop there.
Thanks very much to our three speakers. We're going to shift now to Q&A. And I see that the Q&A space is starting to get populated with some questions. I'm going to begin with a question to each of our participants, then we'll shift over to our guests. And the first question is for Adam. Adam, your presentation included reflection on some striking trends of recent years. And from what we understand in deciphering these trends, can you speculate on what the next 10 years might look like? Will the trends that you defined in your remarks continue? Or are there some new or altered trends on the horizon?
Thanks, Kim. I'm not going to try and become a futurologist, but when you start looking at what's happened over the last decade, and it does suggest that the increasing authority and capacity that many states have is something that, assuming economic growth continues at relatively high levels, is going to continue. And at the same time, you have seen these increasing trends towards more authoritarian states, which is fairly clearly documented and identified now. So if you take a step back and look at what a lot of these conflicts are and where the strains are coming from, some of them are, many of them, these subnational conflicts in particular that we've been discussing, relate to how states are growing or how states are consolidating internally. So how they are increasingly managing to control internal territory, often how they're managing to form a common identity. Now, for a mainstream nationalist, for many, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, that may well look like a very positive process. But for many of the minorities that we're talking about, that looks an awful lot like internal colonialism of one sort or another. And you see these trends and traits played out in different ways. In cases, it's to do with groups that see themselves or are identified by others as being indigenous. And you see issues concerning migration from the center to the periphery or internationally that play into all those tensions. All of these concerns are likely to continue, but they're not necessarily likely to lead to enormous amounts of violence because of the capacity of states to keep a lid on a lot of it. At the same time, you're seeing these challenges very significantly in terms of what actually a nation is defined as being. If you have more strident ethnic nationalism or religious nationalism, as you've seen in many countries across the region, then national development becomes something that is still more of an imposition, whether that's taking place across an entire nation or whether it's something that is particular to a specific area. And as you see this move away from what could very loosely be termed liberal values, but they're not necessarily Western liberal values so much more as a notion of pluralism, a notion of tolerance, a notion of understanding, which lie behind the basis of many of these countries, and often tell a very successful story of gelling disparate populations together. You see an awful lot of tensions there at the moment. That's the majoritarian streak that Sydney was referring to. So within all of that, I think you're likely to see, for the identity-based conflict and elements of extremism that we've been looking at, continued problems and continued concerns. Obviously, there are other forms of conflict out there as well, from pervasive violence against women, gender-based violence, through to the risk of international conflict. But what we're dealing with in this report particularly tends to follow that sort of a trend.
Great, thank you, Adam. My next question is for Sydney. Sydney, in your presentation, you spoke about Indigenous people and migrants, about land conflicts, all of which are in some sense linked to identity-based tensions. With continued economic growth adding to the pressure and predicted climate change on top of that, is this likely to lead to potentially disruptive effects? And if so, what steps might be taken to minimize those effects going forward? Sydney, you're muted.
There's no question that that this can have disruptive effects. I think that throughout the region, we're seeing concerns about people living in coastal areas where increasing flooding is an issue. We're also seeing the deforestation that comes as a result of plantation expansion being another source of flooding, as there are no longer any barriers to river waters coming in. And there's very little power that local communities have when it's the state or state oligarchs working with private companies to address some of these. I should say, though, that when we look at land conflicts in the region, too often they're seen as black and white, as poor farmers against bad companies. And it's never that simple. And increasingly, there are some good elements in the private sector that are actually trying to work with local communities to find solutions on the ground. So it's not always the case that all the farmers are purer than the driven snow. And it's also not the case that all companies are blacker than the most evil kinds of entities. Increasingly, there's room for dialogue and compromise in a way that I think could facilitate some of the work that the Asia Foundation is doing.
Great, thank you. The next question is for Sophia. Sophia, can you suggest some potential interventions that could strengthen the economic resilience of migrant workers?
Okay, I mean, I think, you know, as I said in my presentation, migrant workers are part, you know, their situation is really embedded in some deep structural issues, a lot of them relating to conflict and all the other things that we've heard about. But I think some of the possible interventions that are tangible going forward really would involve building their long-term, investing in and building their long-term skills development, certification. I mean, we have seen how skilled migrant workers fare better even during times of crisis and conflict, especially when we look at women who are able to move up the value chain and break, you know, away from some of the conditions that are unfavorable. So just investing in skills and certification programs is I think, a very, very important intervention that one can look at long term. The others, you know, another really important one is we need to look at how we can promote rehabilitation of returning migrants. Now, we've seen, you know, as even whether it's this pandemic or other times of crises, a lot of migrant workers are forced to come back or displaced again and return home, or they come back and then they are not able to integrate and go back abroad. Now, a lot of these migrant workers bring a lot of innovation, new skills, new ideas, and more importantly, new work ethics. How can we invest in or develop programs that rehabilitate them into the local economy by investing in skills that promote their entrepreneurship, business acumen, their networks, so that returning migrants become part of domestic long-term economic development. And you know how this links to the conflict and violence agenda is that when you see more shared economic growth and prosperity, it is going to lead to, you know, lesser conflict. I mean, of course, there's, you know, ethnic conflicts or whatever, but I think these are the two angles. If we try to tackle them, in addition to all the sort of political and other interventions one can make, I think these are really important to strengthen the economic resilience of migrant workers and workers in the new economy, which includes, you know, like a lot of the internal domestic migrants.
Great, thanks, Sophia. We're going now to our external guests, and the first question comes from Patty Barron of the World Bank and a former Asia Foundation colleague. This is directed to Adam. And Patty asks, or notes that you mentioned a theory that subnational conflict was declining in the region because states were gaining more capacity and hence could control or possibly buy off local insurgents. Patty notes that this growth and expansion of capacity came earlier when subnational conflicts were exploding, with growth rates declining in recent years when many of the insurgencies have tailed off. Do you think there's anything in the explanation that subnational conflicts are declining because of conflict fatigue, with Myanmar as a potential exception?
I don't think there's any particular reason why conflict fatigue would suddenly kick in over a certain period of time. Conflict fatigue can be a factor in conflicts at any point, and you see these conflicts generationally wax and wane, right? As newer generations take a different line, maybe are more conciliatory, as older fighters become more cynical or more willing to negotiate or find a peaceful solution. So I don't see why that would suddenly kick in at a particular point, unless it somehow related to a huge growth in conflict a particular generation earlier. So that might be a continual factor. And of course, these conflicts haven't gone away. And this is part of the point I was trying to make. They've just become less bloody. So it's not that insurgents have all given up. It's that states, in many cases, it's that states appear to be controlling them more effectively. Now, in some cases, that has happened through reforms rather than purely through security impositions. Mindanao would be a very obvious example of that. In other cases, that's not necessarily the case, and it is more through a security imposition or through reforms that are very much defined by the central state and their interests, as you might see in India and Kashmir, for example. So it's never clear cut, and you're dealing with a huge area where there are going to be diverse responses and local conditions and factors are bound to be more significant in any one place than any big global trend. But it points towards what I've broadly speaking been discussing, and subnational conflicts are part of it, but there are also other forms of violence, which insofar as the data shows, and statistics are partial, but the data across many different data sets shows the same trend. So there clearly is something going on here. I mean, I'd be open to a broader discussion about what's happening and to pick that apart. It's a very interesting one. But certainly the link between economic growth and violence is a complicated one. While if you take a big, long duration of time and you look at wealthier countries compared with poorer countries, more economic growth, wealth does tend to reduce levels of conflict. When you break that down into any specific country, it is not possible to say that growth will lead to a reduction in conflict at all. And you see many, many examples where frustration at the nature of that growth, at how it's been unequal or about how resources have been captured by one particular group, have exacerbated conflict traits across the region.
Thanks, Adam. The next question is directed to Sydney from Wakas Raja. And if I've understood correctly, Wakas is interested in hearing from Sydney on the implications of poverty for recruitment by extremist organizations. And he asked, does poverty seed recruitment? Would poverty reduction have an impact? Sydney?
I think, as Adam has underlined as well, addressing poverty without addressing political grievances almost never works. And one example now is Papua, where since 2018, we have seen an escalation of violence in the Central Highlands with a more active OPM, that's the Free Papua movement, more control, expansion of geographic control by the OPM, which is also now better resourced and better armed than it was 3 years ago. And this is in the face of what was supposed to have been a priority area for the central government in Indonesia, pouring money into Papua. The president visited the area more times than any other president, but the focus was all on infrastructure. It was as though infrastructure was seen as the key to solving the problem, and that's clearly not the key. I think the government is going to have to look more introspectively at why conflict and violence in the Central Highlands have increased and why the OPM is stronger now than it was 3 years ago.
Thank you. The next question is posed by Amber Eric, and it's to Sophia. Sophia, Amber notes that you spoke about the importance of improving social policy and wonders if you could share more in your thinking about the dimensions, gender dimensions in particular. How are the needs different for men and women migrants? Sophia?
I mean, that's a very important point. I mean, there's significant gender dimensions to to men and women migrants. I mean, if we just even take a look at, we did a series of studies that in both South and Southeast Asia, and found that, you know, during the pandemic, which wasn't just exclusive to the pandemic, but this reflected the kind of, you know, employment patterns that exist. Women workers tend to be more employed in those sectors that get hardest hit by certain shocks. So during the pandemic, we saw that women were employed in domestic care or other personal care services industries, which were, you know, restricted, and there was a larger loss of employment, whereas men tend to be employed in sectors which were considered essential, whether it was construction or you know, food service delivery or whatever. And so these, you know, immediately bring to light that there are significant differences in the kinds of jobs that women take. Now, when you take this to migrant workers, we're seeing the same kind of thing when you're looking at internal migration or external. There are more women that are employed in sectors which are unregulated or informal. They're in informal jobs within the formal economy or working more in the informal sector. So how does this, you know, relate to social policy? Now, I think that one of the biggest implications on social policies that point about redefining work. So not classifying informal workers and having them then fall through the net and not social safety net and not be, you know, eligible for some of the financial support and other cash support that's provided during these times of crisis, or for general, even, you know, social security that is provided. I think that needs a really a significant redefinition. And then how the private, how private sector employers are made to respond to providing a certain level of income support or social safety net is also important, especially when it comes to the gig economy. And this transcends, you know, any kind of situation where we've got a pandemic or a conflict. So definitely there is a need to revisit how social protection programs are designed, what kind of healthcare services and you know, adequate and safe housing is provided. These are really, really important, and there's significant gender dimensions to this.
Thanks, Sophia. I apologize if my microphone is picking up noise. There's somebody wielding a chainsaw in my neighbor's garden, so hopefully nothing too dramatic. The next question comes from Nicholas Becklin. It's addressed to all of our panelists, but I suspect particularly to Adam and to Sydney, and that is, what are the prospect of future anti-Chinese violence? Is the prospect of future anti-Chinese violence as a result of China's increasingly visible footprint in the region? There's a long history of it in some quarters, but we've also seen some recent examples. Adam, maybe you'd like to take that first.
Okay, the report doesn't deal at length with international tensions, with international relations and so on. There have been this report, compared to the one 4 or 5 years ago, did pick out a couple of international incidents, particularly involving India, in both Pakistan and China, which weren't highlighted 4 or 5 years ago, I think partly because there was an absence of such incidents at the time. So you do see some international flashpoints already occurring, but they're extremely minor in terms of actual numbers of deaths. I think in terms of the political significance, diplomatic, geopolitical significance of these shifts, yes, it's very, very significant. Whether it's going to lead to actual international armed conflict or whether it's going to stimulate tensions at the local level is a range of different issues. On the international level, it's perfectly possible that the implications of armed conflict will be so great that people will avoid them. That has certainly tended to be the trend recently, although I wouldn't want to call that. At the local level, you do start seeing tensions where a particular group is associated with forms of economic enterprise which can be presented by leaders as denying others opportunities. Absolutely. And it's very, very easy for leaders to scapegoat and use minorities, particularly when a minority group is new arrivals or seen as being new arrivals or are dominant in business and are particularly linked to another country, to drum up support and also to drum up hatred and antagonism. I don't think that's a new trend. I mean, you saw it with in the late 1990s in Indonesia very, very prominently and extremely violently, actually. And you've seen it in the past in many countries in the region. So I think it's a continuity, actually, that you are likely to regard as a bigger risk, given the underlying trends of more majoritarian perspectives, more identity-based politicking.
Thanks, Adam. Sadie, is there anything you'd like to add to Adam's observations?
Yes, I think that Nicola's question is very much aimed at China's Belt and Road Initiative and bringing in Chinese workers as a consequence of some of this dependence on Chinese financing for infrastructure projects. And in Indonesia, there has been resentment expressed through, in some cases, real serious demonstrations by workers who see the Chinese coming in as taking their jobs, who see the Chinese coming in as not just being managerial, but in some cases being fairly menial individuals coming in. And it links to the concern that local Chinese have dominated the economy, and this is somehow an alliance of the government with China and the local ethnic Chinese to deprive the Muslim pribumi or indigenous entrepreneurs of their rightful role in the economy. And this fuels majoritarian movements. This kind of theme was very clear in some of the statements during the 2019 election campaign. Thus far, it hasn't led, touch wood, to any additional violence. There have been some terrorist plots that never got very far that were directed against Chinese businesses, mainland Chinese operations in Indonesia. And interestingly, there is a connection made between the government, the Indonesian government's reliance on China for Belt and Road Initiative projects, and this notion by hardline majoritarian types, that Jokowi is somehow really a closet communist, and he's using the workers coming in as a fifth column to spread communism in Indonesia. Now, of course, it's ridiculous, but the idea that there's still somehow a latent threat of communism in Indonesia is a very widespread belief, even today.
Thanks, Sydney. Sydney, the next question comes to you as well, too, and it's from Karina Indrasari, and she asks, in your presentation, you mentioned that even though we still have terrorist cells in Indonesia, the Philippines, state efforts to counter violent extremism, particularly those who support ISIS, has been quite successful. Do you think that the pandemic has had a role in this declining trend in the region?
I'm not convinced that state interventions have been that successful. I think where we've seen, I'll qualify that in a moment. I think where we've seen men and women pull out of extremist movements, overwhelmingly, this has been at their own initiative, not because of government interventions, because of realization that the costs outweighed the benefits, concerns over family, lots of reasons, and there actually is a low recidivism rate, relatively low recidivism rate, but it's because of this individual awareness rather than government programs. In the Philippines, it's slightly different because I think you can make an argument that some of the efforts in Basilan to give incentives to people to come out of Abu Sayyaf and then stay out have been reasonably successful, but it also may be too early to judge, because one of the issues that others have noted is the cyclical nature of some of the violence in Mindanao, and we are at a relatively low point now. But what happens, for example, if the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao is increasingly not meeting expectations? Is there a possibility that we see some of the MILF fighters who are frustrated going back to more militant movements? And that's always been what's fueled some of the more extremists of the movements in the Philippines. So I think I wouldn't brand everything as success just yet.
Thank you. I'm going to pose a question now to Adam. Adam, as you noted, the third keynote essay in the State of Conflict report features the insights of 3 individuals on the impact of social media and other technology in Asia. One of the 3, Maria Ressa, has just been co-awarded the Nobel Prize, as you noticed, which has helped to focus global attention on this issue. Can we ask you to expand a bit, Adam, on the issues relating to social media, misinformation, and hate speech? And I'm going to piggyback a question from Elisa Pantastico to any panelist, but I'll point it to you, and that is, how can governments, civil society prevent or regulate media manipulators in spreading disinformation that fuels conflict?
Okay, thanks, Kim. It's possible that Sydney or Sophia would want to chip in as well here. By now we've all heard familiar comments about how people and particularly governments in many cases are gaming the system of the online space, and how the way in which the actual metrics of the online space itself can act to push polarization or extreme views. What you saw coming through the 3 interviews was a perspective that one might naively think that this started in developed countries which have had more connectivity and then spread to developing countries or parts of Asia. In fact, it was pretty clear that that's not the case. That various countries in Asia, the Philippines is prominently mentioned and described as having been a petri dish for media manipulation. This is something that came across from Chris Wiley, the Cambridge Analytica controversial figure from several years ago. And he talked about how companies such as his experimented in the Philippines to see what could be done with manipulating online spaces. Not recently, this is going back close to a decade now. So it's no longer a new phenomenon. And in areas with weaker institutions, with less oversight of government, less oversight of social media companies themselves, which are mostly not from the region, with a couple of exceptions, you see a real challenge here in terms of regulation. And the implications of that, often for individuals such as Maria Ressa, who not only has been going through and is still going through political challenges, but has also experienced mass organized sexist derogatory insults directed at her, indicate the extent of the challenge. What can be done about it? And again, the report, I think, provides a range of quotes and perspectives here on how some kind of multi-stakeholder response is potentially viable. And it's not going to happen overnight. Regulating social media is an extremely complex field involving issues of freedom of speech, as well as issues of clamping down on bad behavior. So one of the comments in the report was that ultimately it comes down to a global, regional and domestic conversation about responsibility, who can act and should act, about responsiveness, how quickly actions can be taken, and transparency and accountability. So there's a whole range of extremely challenging and thorny issues to address. I think, to be honest, a lot of them will not be addressed. This issue is not going to be solved. Social media are going to be driving tensions and pressures for a significant time to come. But the opportunities are to, what all the interviewees said, are to try and build discussion, debate, coalitions and alliances that cut across so many of these different sectors, from the international environment where norms can be generated, down to the very local level where community figures are trying to deal with and address the implications, and at the national or local levels in between, where different actors across different sectors, private sector, government, local communities and so on, can try and come together and at least help raise a discourse, raise a discussion, a debate, and start trying to propose actions that can be taken.
Adam and Kim, if I may just add, I think that, I think like social media, and in all of its manifestations is here to stay. And the point that you made earlier at the beginning, Adam, about the closing space, I think if we look at it from the angle of regulation, I mean, what can governments or civil society do? That was the question. I think regulation tends to be, like you said, it's one approach and can be, but I think, from what we've seen, and we've been doing a lot of programming in trying to get communities to debunk myths and et cetera, and, together with your group, I think the important thing is to look at it in the long term. Is the only solution is to build the awareness and capacity among communities and individuals to better understand issues and sort of create the space for long-term tolerance and create that space for debate, which is shrinking. And so when we talk about regulation, that makes me a bit nervous, just because I think regulation is important, but it can be, as you've just said, it can easily be manipulated in situations where it can be taken in another direction. So I think while regulation is really important, it's also really equally important to raise, to implement programs that just enhance the awareness, knowledge, and, promote, programs that, or implement programs that just promote more peace and tolerance, rather than just only looking at from a regulatory perspective.
I think we can also look at some very interesting initiatives that NGOs across the region have undertaken. There are various groups that are committed to hoax busting. There's a group called Hoax Busters in Indonesia that tries to take fake news and false information and correct it online and disseminate it. Getting it properly disseminated is one of the challenges, but you also have groups weighing whether or not, civil society groups weighing whether or not they should use bots and buzzers the way governments use bots and buzzers. And if so, how do they get the technological know-how to be able to do that effectively? It is interesting that some people are attracted to extremists over YouTube by the popularity of the number of followers they have, or the number of likes and so on that have been manifested. So by deliberately inflating or the kind of support or followers or likes that you have for more moderate individuals, that may be a way of changing perceptions over the internet. But there are so many ethical issues involved in dealing with this that we haven't even begun to touch the surface.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. We're bumping up against our allotted time, but I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question that's mostly directed to Sydney, but Sophia, I'm also going to invite you to comment if you'd like, and that is, I'm curious about the state of dialogue among domestic stakeholders in government, civil society, academia, and perhaps even the private sector in analyzing and reflecting on the phenomena and trends on which Sydney's paper reflects and in which our broader conversation this morning is touched. So I'm wondering, is there a healthy Asian-owned discourse among these different stakeholder groups in monitoring trends, reflecting on their implications, perhaps assuming a critical ownership of the kinds of solutions which Sydney shared in your last slide? So Sydney, you first, and then Sophia, if you're here to comment, maybe from the private sector perspective in particular, Sophia.
Let's see. So I think there are a lot of discussions taking place across countries, within the region, sometimes between regions, especially there's a lot more dialogue than there used to be, for example, between Southeast Asia and South Asia in a way that's quite interesting. But I think the challenge is to do a better job of identifying best practices in a way that can be translated out of the region where that particular model was developed. By and large, I don't think study tours from one country to another or attempted templates from one country to another work that well, unless there's a very clear understanding of what the differences are in the place where you're trying to adapt a particular model. But there's still a lot of scope for shared experience. The question is how you actually translate those experiences into useful models and exchanges.
Yeah. Sophia, anything you would add about the private sector?
Well, I mean, you know, I think the private sector, you know, I mean, my view is just that, you know, when it comes to raising, you know, awareness or promoting or preventing conflict or promoting worker welfare or whatever, I think the private sector is an equal partner in terms of, you know, in public. I mean, I raised this in my discussion, my presentation earlier, even when we're talking about social protection programs, or we're talking about, you know, welfare or, you know, any kind of thing. I think that there has to be a greater participation of the private sector or the employers in this whole dimension. Now, when it comes to promoting peace and conflict, I think it comes back to what role can all sorts of institutions play. And I think that's really important that we often don't understand, which is that, you know, I mean, I tend to always emphasize that there has to be an investment in building long-term resilience, which is built upon raising awareness, which is built on shared responsibility, which is about, you know, promoting more, introducing, you know, compassion and care in how we address whether it's employment conditions or whether it's a whole range of issues in community, you know, safety. So yes, the private sector has an, you know, an equal or shared responsibility, and you know, unfortunately, I mean, if anything, the last 18 months have shown that, you know, there's been a massive, I think it was a time for reckoning to try to better understand how things could move in a more positive direction, but it's been you know, a bit of a disconnect between what we've seen in public policy leadership and the private sector, and it's not really come together. And I think that something has got to be done, because otherwise we're going to see all sorts of conflict and violence persist, and vulnerabilities just continue to grow.
Great, thank you, Sophia. So when I was busy invoking the tyranny of the chair in that last question, Willie Galton was busy posing two very thoughtful questions to Sydney and Adam, but I'm going to invoke the tyranny one more time, because we are bumping up against our 90 minutes. I know that people have to go on to their next appointment. So Lily, apologies for that, but I promise that Sydney and Adam will both take a look at your questions and come back to you offline on that. So I'd like to close by thanking our three panelists today. I think it's been for me, it's been a really interesting session and learning experience, and I know that all of us on the virtual call will join me in thanking our three panelists for their thoughtful observations and for commenting on the many questions that were posed today. As Adam mentioned, the report is available online. You can access it from a couple of different points, and as we said, we will be very happy, and Adam and his team in particular will be very glad to receive feedback from all of you as users of the report. This is the second one. In future, we will be very curious to hear how the report is received, and particularly some of its practical implications for those that are working in this important space. So my thanks to everyone for joining us today. And please, for those who are regular subscribers to Asia Foundation events, we encourage you to continue to join us to these events and to share our notices more broadly so we can expand our audience. Thanks very much to everyone.
Thank you, everybody.